They found the letter, folded 4 times, soft at the creases, tucked into the lining of a field coat no one had worn in decades. The paper had yellowed, edges curling like old leaves, but the ink, though faded, still held. It wasn't addressed, it wasn't sealed, but it was unmistakably personal, and it had never been sent. The man who wrote it, Sergeant William Bill Thatcher, died 15 years ago in a small town in Ohio, where he ran a hardware store and sat quietly at the back of church on Sundays. Most people knew him as a solid man, honest, steady, not prone to talk about back then. He rarely spoke about the war at all, except to mention once, while watching a 4th of July parade, that marching bands always made his knees hurt. But the letter told a different story. It was written to his wife, Margaret, sometime in the fall of 1944. The first lines were simple, ordinary. He wrote about the cold, about the lousy socks, about a guy in his unit who could fall asleep standing up. But as the paragraphs continued, his tone changed. The sentences stretched, words turned heavier. "I don't know who I'll be when this is over," he wrote. "I want to believe I'm still your husband, but some days I feel like a man I wouldn't introduce to you." He signed it only with his first initial, B, and for reasons no one fully knows, not even his children, the letter was never mailed. But maybe it was never meant to be. Before the war, Bill Thatcher sold nails and cut lumber behind his father's counter in a small hardware store in Chillicothe. He married Margaret Tilley when he was 25. She had a crooked smile and a stubborn way of never taking help carrying groceries. Their house was plain, white-painted with green shutters and a porch swing that creaked when it rained. He wasn't a letter writer, not by nature, but war changes the habits of men, and Bill, far from home, found himself reaching for pen and paper more than he expected. Mostly short notes, safe, clean versions of the day. "We had beans again. Someone got a harmonica. Tell your mother I still can't get the mud out of my boots." But then came that one letter, the one he kept revising. He started it in pencil, switched to pen, wrote it on the back of requisition forms when paper ran out. Sometimes, when he ran out of words, he'd draw instead. Tiny sketches in the margins, a pack of cigarettes, a pair of boots, Margaret's initials inside a heart. The letter changed with the war. It wasn't dated, but you could track the months by the tone. In one paragraph, he mentions snow. In another, he writes about cherry blossoms blooming far from home. The handwriting gets looser, shakier. One corner of the page is stained. Coffee, maybe blood. He folded and unfolded it daily, carried it in the breast pocket of his uniform, close to his heart, literally. And yet, despite how often he touched it, read it, whispered pieces of it into the dark, he never sealed it, never gave it to the mail clerk, never let it go. No one, not even Margaret, ever saw that version of her husband. By mid-April 1945, the letter was already a companion, a ritual. Bill would unfold it each night in the dim flicker of a lantern, eyes tracing the same words, fingers brushing the worn creases like a rosary. The others in his unit teased him, called it his pocket Bible. He'd just smile and say, "Not quite." The war had shifted. The noise was constant now. Mortars in the morning, rifle fire in the trees. the kind of tension that lived between breaths. Men came and went. Some names never got remembered, but the letter remained. He kept adding to it, a paragraph here, a sentence there, and every time he thought maybe this would be the night he sent it, something held him back. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was the growing knowledge that he was no longer the man who had written the first lines. One day, just past dawn, their convoy was hit. Shrapnel tore through the lead truck. Men dove, scattered, screamed. Bill was thrown into a ditch, his chest torn open in a bright, sharp line that would scar until his final day. The letter, tucked beneath his jacket, stayed dry, but was torn clean through. He passed out clutching it. When he woke up, it was in the pocket of a borrowed field coat. His hands were bandaged, his ribs broken, and the war for him was over. But he never asked about the letter, never looked for it. And when he finally came home that summer, with his medals in a sack and Margaret waiting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, he hugged her so hard she laughed. Then he said nothing at all. Not about the pain, not about the letter, not about who he'd almost become. In the years that followed, Bill Thatcher lived a life that looked from the outside like healing. He rebuilt the shop, coached Little League, learned how to cook pancakes on Sunday mornings. He whistled while he shaved, left notes in Margaret's lunch pail, and paid his taxes on time. But he never spoke about the war. Not in church, not at Rotary meetings, not even when his son asked what the medals were for. Service, he'd say, like a lot of men. He kept the uniform, though, pressed, folded, sealed in a garment bag that hung in the back of the hall closet. No one was allowed to touch it. When Margaret asked once, gently, what he wanted to do with it, he said, "Not yet," and changed the subject. She let it be. What Margaret didn't know, what no one knew, was that for all his calm, Bill still carried one piece of that war stitched to his bones, the words he never sent. He'd wake sometimes in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and whisper into the dark, "I almost told you. I swear, I almost did." Margaret would rub his back and hold him until he drifted off again. But she never asked what he meant. Not once. And so the letter remained forgotten, lost in fabric and time, a ghost folded into a soldier's coat, neither sent nor destroyed, a confession without a listener. And Bill, who had written it during the loneliest days of his life, never found the courage or maybe the need to deliver it, because somewhere inside, he feared that what he'd written then no longer matched the man she saw now. Or worse, that it still did. It wasn't found until after Bill had been gone nearly 16 years. Margaret was sorting boxes in the attic one slow September morning, trying to clear the dust of decades from a life she still hadn't entirely let go of. The uniform bag was heavy in her hands. She unzipped it carefully, breathing in the faint scent of cedar and something else, metal maybe, or time. And tucked between the lining and the wool, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, she found it, a single folded page, thin as moth wings, frayed at the corners, but unmistakably his. She sat down on the floor and unfolded it. The handwriting was slow, deliberate, as if every letter had been chosen like a stone in a river. There were no greetings, no closing, no date. Only the raw, aching center of a man trying to say what war had no words for. He wrote about guilt, about how some mornings he didn't recognize his own reflection, about how, if he didn't come home, he wanted her to remember the version of him that fixed the porch railing and whistled when he carved the turkey, not the man who flinched at thunder. And then, in the middle of the page, 5 words underlined twice, shaky but clear. "You deserve to know everything." Margaret read the letter once, then again, and then she didn't cry. She just folded it slowly, pressed it to her chest, and stayed there, motionless, until the light began to fade. She never mentioned it to her children, never brought it up at the breakfast table. But after that day, she started wearing his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, and every night she whispered, "Good night, B," just once, like he was still listening. Years later, their granddaughter Nora would find the letter again while preparing Margaret's things for donation. By then, the ink had faded more, but the words still held. She asked her father if he'd ever seen it. He hadn't. None of them had, not even Bill's son. Nora read it aloud once, in a trembling voice, in the kitchen where Margaret used to make cornbread on Sundays. When she finished, no one spoke for a long time. The letter said everything Bill had never said out loud, but somehow they all understood it had been there, between them, all along. They framed it eventually, not to hang, just to keep, the kind of thing that doesn't belong on display, but in a drawer you open when you need to feel close to something real, something unfinished. There's a strange kind of peace in a letter that's never sent. It's like a breath held in time, a moment that never closes, an echo of a man who never got to explain himself fully, but tried. And maybe that's what love is in the end. Not the grand gestures, not the promises or the parades, but the quiet choice to carry someone else's truth, even when it's heavy, even when it arrives decades too late. Margaret never needed the letter to know who he was. But still, some nights, when the wind moved just right through the trees outside their old house, she'd go upstairs, open the drawer, and read it again. Not because she had questions, but because in those words, in that folded page soaked with silence and truth, Bill was still speaking, and she was still listening.